But we have several different kinds of pine trees here: ponderosa pine, white pine, sugar pine. I just got to the end of my expertise on pine. We have white wood that is grand fir, white fir, lodgepole pine. There, I thought of another pine.
Pine sol.
Pine sol. Pine sol is a big commodity.
Welcome to another episode of the Essential Craftsman Podcast. I'm Nate. I got my dad here, the Essential Craftsman. How are you doing?
Hi, guys. Doing good.
We're going to be talking about logging, forestry, timber, lumber. We are in the, at least what at one time would have been considered the timber capital of the world. Is that right?
The Roseburg's motto was timber capital of the nation.
Was that a motto that was like printed places and kind of generally known?
Yeah, it was on the city logo. It was on the sign at the entrance to the town. It was. We were proud of it.
Some portion of that was because of Roseburg Lumber, which was the company who was also the big dog in the industry. Is that right?
Yeah, Roseburg Lumber Company was built by Kenneth Ford between, I'm going to make this up a little bit, but I think his first paychecks were issued during the Great Depression.
Wow.
And only 3 grocery stores in town would cash them for about 80 cents on the dollar.
Wow.
Okay. And he ended up building Roseburg Lumber into the largest solely owned lumber business in the world.
Wow. How many mills do you think were in? So to put a timeline on this, we want to talk about lumber and timber kind of in your lifetime.
Yeah, what I know about
and
it. Yeah.
Maybe we'll start the discussion with when you were a kid and kind of growing up. You were born in Roseburg.
Yeah.
How many mills existed in the county or in town when you were a kid and coming of age?
So 12 to 16 years before I was born, there were 244 sawmills operating in Douglas County. They were everywhere, little mills, every place, medium-sized mills, a few big mills. It was the beginning of the industrialization of West Coast softwood. Mm-hmm. And now, today, I just kind of did a rough count 5 minutes ago, and there are probably 12 mills operating in Douglas County. So I would guess when I was in high school, there might have been 30, 40 perhaps, because they'd gotten big and the big guys had squished the little guys, but there were lots and lots of mills operating.
And there are empty mills everywhere right now. You drive most places and you'll pass an empty mill.
And some of them are almost archaeological sites. I mean, old empty mills, and some of them are as recent as 2 years ago, to where they're just being scrapped and the buildings torn down and the auction has already happened, and so at various times they've been killed.
So a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with how the timber industry works, but let me explain it as I understand it, and then you correct me where it needs to be corrected. Loggers, or forest workers, or men with chainsaws,
loggers,
dig out in the woods, cut the trees down, buck them to the correct length, put them on a truck and bring them to the mill and sell them to the mill, and the mill pays them for the logs they deliver. Is that phase one? Yeah.
It used to be entirely the loggers, the men with the chainsaws. Before that, the men with the crosscut saws who would cut the trees down and get them to market. Now a lot of it is much more mechanized than that, with feller bunchers, and where the actual cutting of the trees and the taking the limbs off and cutting them to length happens with big equipment on the ground in moments. But there's still plenty of hand logging in that way that goes on. But you're right, the logger is typically an employee of a large logging concern. Sometimes it's a subsidiary of the sawmill corporation itself. Sometimes it's an independent logger, a gyppo logger as they're termed, where all they do is log. Sometimes it's a landowner. You own, private timber, the ranches, down in the lower lands and in the Coast Range. There's lots of privately held timberland, and so the owner perhaps has a bulldozer, with a blade winch canopy set up to log, and he, on a small basis, takes the logs off of his own property, cuts them to length, enters into a purchase agreement with a sawmill to sell his logs to a mill, and then arranges the trucking. It's hauled to the mill, and he sells as the individual. So sometimes it's a logging company logging public or private timber. Sometimes it's a landowner himself logging, and sometimes it's a branch of the lumber corporation logging their own property or public property sometimes, and selling the logs or sawing them.
So in the case of a landowner, do they enter into an agreement to sell the mill their logs kind of before they show up with the first load? So basically a landowner would pick a mill or maybe price out a couple different mills and walk in and say, this is what I have. How does that work?
So it depends on what the market is at the moment, because lumber is a commodity. Logs are a commodity, and lumber is a separate commodity, actually. Log prices are tied to lumber prices. Lumber prices are tied to the open market for lumber, and so that price trickles back down. It's like gasoline prices and crude oil prices, right? And so ranchers or people who own land kind of watch the log market and find out what prices are and try to decide when they're going to harvest. And typically log prices are higher in the winter because it's hard to get logs out in the winter, and they're lower in the summer because everybody can log in the summer, so they rise and fall seasonally. But a landowner will call a log buyer, which is the person at the mill who's responsible for making the deals with whoever's selling the logs. And the log buyer, if it's a lot of logs, will come out and look at his stand, walk through the stand, see what percentage of what grade of logs he has, and say, we'll pay you what's known as a camp run price. That is, all of the footage, all of the board footage that we buy from you will pay this amount per thousand.
Like a flat fee.
A flat fee. Or, depending on the stand and the species, it might be a graded log sale where we'll pay you this much for 3 peelers, this much for select mills, this much for number 1 mills and number 2 mills and select culls, and each different grade of log commands a different price.
Oh, and so that deal will be made beforehand and kind of agreed upon.
Yes.
That's the deal, and then okay, bring your logs anytime after Friday, and we'll pay you.
That's it. There are taxes that pertain also. There's a severance tax in Oregon where the state gets a percentage of the value of the logs when they're sold, and so all of these things are determined before the trees hit the ground, ideally, and then it's just it's a purchase order that you get with the buyer, and then the terms of that purchase order carry through until the mill decides we're done paying like that, we want to renegotiate, or the property owner says, I found a better deal or I'm done, and then that deal sunsets. And if they sell again next year, they got to re-up another purchase order usually.
In the case of a private landowner, and maybe it's different today than it was 40 years ago, but do you have to get a permit in order to cut your own trees down, or can you basically just sell it kind of like it was firewood?
It's called a cutting permit. The state wants to be notified, and part of the reason for that is because here in Douglas County, Douglas Forest Protective Association provides fire protection, and they have some responsibility to help put out fires if they get started. And so since they have that responsibility and that authority, they want to know when you're going to start logging, when you start operations. And they also have the authority to make sure that you comply with fire codes, fire regulations when fire season starts, so that you're not operating in a way that's likely to set the whole county on fire. And so that's all part of the process of beginning to log.
So what does that mean for the loggers? Like having a fire extinguisher like attached to every saw, and what do they need to comply?
Yeah, there are a lot of regulations, and I can get out of my depth here a little bit because I've been pretty much just in construction for the last 20 years here.
Yeah. Well, maybe speak to it from when you were logging last.
So in general terms, a cutter, when you're on the ground falling, in fire season, you have to have a little fire extinguisher with you. Is that one behind me?
That's some version of one, yeah.
And so a cutter will carry something about like that, or even a little smaller, dangling from his belt with his other tools, so that if a spark from his saw, or maybe he's filling his gas can and spills some gas and it's on the exhaust, boom, he's got a fire.
Yeah.
And it's in the middle of the summer when the whole world is just a pile of tinder around here.
Yeah.
He's got something he can just hit it with and put it out.
Yeah.
Down on the landing, the center of operations where the logs...
Describe the landing real quick, just in terms of the lay of the land.
A landing is a space, hopefully somewhat level, where trucks can either pull through or back into, where your log loader, whatever you're using to put the logs on the truck, can operate, where whatever you're using to pull the logs down, whether it's a yarder or a cat or a skidder or a processor, can bring the logs to and put them in a stack. There'll be 1 or 2 guys working on the landing, bumping knots and making sure they're cut to length and facilitating the loading of the truck. So sometimes a landing, particularly in this era of self-loading log trucks, sometimes a landing is nothing more than a spot alongside a road where a truck can stop. The loader is on the truck. He throws the logs essentially out of the ditch up onto his truck and goes on down the road. But historically, the bigger and flatter and more open your landing is, the safer it is and the easier it is to operate.
It's kind of like the home base.
The base.
Loggers are where they park their truck that
That's
morning
right.
and stuff.
And the landing moves as the unit, as the hillside is cleaned off, the landing moves to follow the logs, so you don't have to skid them too far. And so to your original question, there needs to be a fire truck or a fire trailer, and the regulations have just changed to where now in Oregon it needs to be a truck, a self-contained unit that has, I think, 1,000 gallons of water and a pump that will discharge through a minimum 1-inch line at a certain rate, so that if a fire does start, you have a chance of knocking it down before it's a problem.
So these landings are built, they don't exist before the loggers show up, and that's one of the first things that the CAT does, I'm guessing, is punch in a road and figure out where should we, how close can we get our trucks and build a landing, which if you're from the area or not, but logging roads around here are a kind of a part of the topography. It's these roads they're not Forest Service roads, they're not always graveled, but they're all over the place. And I guess that's why they were just punching them in as needed.
Now, up on National Forest, on Forest Service, they're pretty sophisticated. They're graded and they're drained and they're graveled, and a lot of them are locked off now.
Yeah.
But down on private ground, they are everywhere, and they're sometimes rough. But an interesting thing, that when the cutters go in to start cutting, they have their eyes open, because in almost every case, they're not the first guys to ever cut down trees there, and it's not the first time the site's been logged. And you can generally look around and see where the skid roads were and where the landings were, and then you fall the timber oriented in the right direction so that it's easy to haul, easy to pull to the skid roads, and easy to get to the landings. So that layout starts really with the first guy to show up.
So when these guys fall the trees, the next step, let's talk about it, how it was 40 years ago maybe, or more, how it was most common. They would fall them, and then the CAT would crawl back there, grab a handful of logs with chokers, which are cables, drag them in, and then those guys would get the next group of trees knocked down, or would they knock everything down in a couple days? And how's the sequencing work?
It depends on the size of the company that's doing the work. If it's a full-blown lumber concern or a full-blown logging business, then the cutters were in there days or weeks ahead of the skidding, and all the trees are down.
Wow.
Okay, it is
chaos.
Down.
It's got to just be like insane up there with all these trees down.
It is. It's really something. Good cutters fall the logs in lead. That is, quartering in the direction they need to go, side by side by side by side by side. But there's brush and there's other junk trees, deciduous trees, hardwood trees that are tangled up in the wreck. And so as the ground machine comes in, he's working his way in, and the choker setters are having to sort of fight their way through that. On a high lead show where you're using a yarder, it's the same thing, but typically 40 years ago when I was here setting chokers up in the Cascades on public ground, the trees were bigger. And so the wreck was grander. And sometimes they would stack up. You could go out on a tree that was bridging a little ravine or something over the top of other logs, and you would be standing 20 feet off the ground and setting your choker 20 feet off the ground, and then running back down that log to get safe before the yarder jerked it out of there and it started heading to the landing at maybe 30 miles an hour or even 40 miles an hour sometimes.
So maybe explain a yarder. If the first version we described is a CAT hooking
ground
up,
logging.
You can kind of probably see the CAT operator, but what is a yarder and what does that look like?
All right, let me finish describing seeing the CAT operator. So with a ground machine, a CAT or a skidder.
Is a skidder a CAT?
It's a rubber tires. It's big rubber tires and articulating in the middle.
Okay.
Off-road roll cage. It's just a log getter. That's all it is.
It's like a CAT just with wheels instead of tracks.
Yeah, but the blade is little. It won't push much dirt. About all it'll do is push dirt out of the way and scratch a corner, really. And sometimes you can chain them up. The tires are 6 or 7 feet in diameter, or 8 feet, and there are chains on them for traction, and they're so fast because when they get up onto good going, they can travel at speeds that a rubber tire can sustain.
Wow.
So they're very fast. Better for smaller wood, typically. But the choker setters working behind the ground machine are in constant eye contact with the CAT skinner if they're going to live.
Is a skinner the slang term for the operator?
Yeah. A mule skinner used to skin mules. A CAT skinner operates the CAT.
Well, what's the mule?
Sorry, from like Old West days.
Oh.
Okay, so the cat skinner came from the term of being a mule skinner.
Oh.
Okay,
I
a
see.
teamster was also a mule skinner, driving mules. Okay.
The person driving a team of mules was
a
called
mule
skinner.
Yes, a mule skinner.
The loggers picked it up and called their cat operator
a cat skinner. That's
Cool.
it. Yeah, and so the choker setter, one or two usually, are always in contact visually and with hand signals, because you can't really yell effectively.
Yeah.
And there are set signals for what you want the cat to do when it gets back to get the turn. That's what you call the logs that go back to the landing behind the machine, is a turn of logs, TURN. When I was just out of high school, so I logged with my dad. We had a D4 when I was 15, 16, 17, and then out of high school, I logged for Little River Box, set chokers behind cats, and usually you would have 5 chokers, 5/8 inch diameter, 12 feet long. And for a while I was working with 2 sets of 5 chokers. So when the cat went into the landing, I had 5 chokers loose that I would set. Mm-hmm. And then when he came back, I would unhook the 5 chokers he drove back with him, get him out of the way, hook the 5 I had just set. They would go back, and it was a real workhouse.
Yeah, it probably took half hour to set 5 chokers or more, right? It could take a while.
Ideally, it's like everything else. It can happen so quick. It can happen so quick to where 5 chokers could be set in 2 minutes. Yeah. I mean, if the logs are right there and if you're not digging choker holes. Mm-hmm. But there is some strategy to setting the chokers. You don't just grab wherever you want. You set them from 2 to 4 feet from the end of the log, and there's too much to it to describe. But so that's a ground machine. That's ground logging. High lead was the idea of, so 40 years ago, high lead logging had just changed from where the yarder, the series of winches and power source, would be set up and strapped down to the ground to stumps underneath a tree, an actual tree, a tall tree that had been topped, stripped of leaves, and rigged with big pulleys. And so the cables would come from the winches on the yarder up the tree, the spar pole, through the blocks, out across the unit and back, and it would set up like a clothesline where the main line would pull the logs in, and the haulback, which went through a tail holt block out on the other side of the unit, would pull the main line and the butt rigging, which is what the chokers were attached to, back out into the unit. So that had recently changed into portable yarders, giant metal contraptions with a telescoping steel spar pole laying down on the carrier, and all the winches and the motors as part of the carrier, and they would drive up the logging roads onto a landing. The pole would be raised hydraulically, stood up, guy-lined back to stumps, scattered around a circumference like 5 to 7 probably guy lines back to stumps.
To anchor it in place.
To anchor it, to hold it up. And then a straw line, which is a 5/16 or 3/8 inch diameter cable, would be pulled by hand out across the unit by the rigging crew, run through a block, brought back, and using that little light line, they would begin to pull the heavy lines out across the unit and rig up the road, it was called. The road was the strip that was logged by the yarder, and pull all of the logs in that road back to the landing, drop them off.
Wow.
The man working on the landing was called a chaser. He was standing there, and as soon as the yarder would bring the logs in and boom, drop them to the ground, he would run out there, and I do mean run, and unhook the chokers. He would chase the turn, unhook the chokers, and then run for his life. The yarder would jerk the chokers back out of that mess of logs and send them back across the landing at high speeds to the crew out in the brush. And all of those commands were communicated with what was called a talkie tutor, which was a radio device whereby by palming kind of a paddle switch, you could cause a whistle to blow on the yarder. And there was a series of signals. 3 signals was go ahead, go ahead. 1 beep, and then 2 short ones meant, I think, slide the haul back. I don't remember because I was never the rigging slinger, but that's how the communication happened.
And that was a loud whistle you could hear for miles, right?
For miles. It would echo for miles.
I remember hearing those in places as a kid and just thinking, God, that thing's loud. That is so annoying.
What's going on up there? Yeah.
So clearly this is dangerous, and I know it used to be, I'm sure it is still, if not the most dangerous job, right up there among the most. And the danger comes from people getting crushed by logs.
Crushed by logs, hit by falling rocks that are dislodged as the cable goes up the hill, killed by cables breaking and falling. Think of this clothesline effect of these super heavy, like a 2-inch diameter main line and an 1.125" diameter haulback. I don't know, pick a number, maybe 800 or 900 or 2,000 feet of it hung up in the air from the machine out, not 2,000 feet, but a long ways.
Yeah.
And it's up there maybe 150 or 200 feet.
Yeah.
And when the yarder slacks the lines, it comes down, whop, onto the ground, all 900 feet of it. Yeah. And if the choker setter forgot that he was standing under the haulback, he's simply dead.
Yeah.
He is simply instantly dead. So there were lots of ways to get killed.
There's just so much more we could talk about there, but I want to move through the big picture here, and then we can circle back later if people have specific interests.
Remind me about a dirty trick you could play on somebody relative to the haulback.
I don't think I'd want any part of any dirty trick around logging. It sounds like...
Well, let me just tell you what it was. So you're all wearing metal hard hats, right? Yeah. And everybody's trying to remember where the haulback is, because sometimes it's right alongside the main line, and sometimes it's clear over here going to where you could run away out of the danger zone from the yarding of the logs and stop right under the haulback, which is clear over your head, and not remember, okay? And so someone who has a mean streak would pick up a branch, and standing behind you would yell, "Haul back!" and then hit your hard hat with the stick, whack! Yeah. And right then, you would get this charge of electricity and adrenaline through your body because you knew you'd just been smashed. Jeez. And instead, you just had to start fighting because it was such a dirty trick.
Yeah, that's beyond a dirty trick. Around here, loggers make a career out of logging. And I'm guessing in a similar way where people in other states would spend a career in an oil field
or fishing or whatever.
Fishing or in a mine.
Yeah.
And what if there was a general career path? I'm guessing a guy would start kind of setting chokers, and then what are some of the other roles that the more experienced and the guys who've been around would fall to later in their career? Or I guess the question is, what does a career look like for a typical logger? Work for 10 years and then get smashed, and that's it?
So it's a lot safer now, like so many other things, partially because of the automation.
Yeah.
And partially because we just don't accept high school kids getting killed 5 or 8 or 10 at a time each summer,
Thankfully. That
was kind of the progression. You would go from a choker setter to a rigging slinger, who was the guy running the controls and laying out the roads, what stumps would be used for tail holts, and you would kind of boss that. And then you would move in onto the landing and maybe run the loader, and then maybe you would run the yarder, and then you would become a side rod and maybe run a couple of different landings, and then a hook tender, and that was about it in the field. But if you didn't have the political savvy or the intelligence to do that, and it did take intelligence, when your body started breaking down, you might just get into the seat of a truck and be a truck driver. Not a bad gig. My dad moved out of the woods into a sawmill, a veneer plant, because the woods were, it just wasn't working with a young growing family, and he could work in a sawmill. Was another sort of a lateral move. If you could arrange it, you like to try to get trained as a cutter, because the cutters just made more money. They were also referred to as bushlers, because for a long time they would be paid according to the volume of wood they put on the ground, the board feet. And they would keep a little log book with them. Each log that they fell and bucked, they would check the diameter and the length, and they would write it in their tally book. And at the end of the day, they would know how much wood they'd put on the ground and thus how much money they made. And they made a ton of money. But they usually only worked 6 hours, because you would exhaust yourself, and once you got tired, you'd get killed. Yeah. And frankly, they usually made about 2 days' wages in 6 hours.
Wow.
So that was a pretty good path. So it was easy for cutters to be more entrepreneurial, because if you were a good cutter and you understood it, maybe you could get a mill owner to trust you to make the agreement with you directly, and you would hire a couple cutters and be, so you could, that step. It was hard to put together the capital to buy equipment to become a logger. Maybe you could buy a truck, or maybe you could buy a cat. And so it was a matter of coming up with the capital to get into an ownership position on the machines you needed.
But as a cutter, you could do it with some saws and
that's it.
A pickup truck.
A pickup and 3 or 4 chainsaws, and you were in business.
And even if you were expensive, you paid for yourself by doing a good job. If the trees were felled in a way that was easy to yard in, it was probably well worth the money.
That's right.
To pay you extra to have it done right.
That's right. And if you weren't breaking trees apart on stumps.
Yeah.
You get them in the right spot so you aren't getting a lot of loss for that, and if your diameters were right. And there's a whole sophisticated game about the volume of the log. And I don't know how interesting this is, but the volume of a log is paid based on the diameter at the small end projected to the length of the log. That's the scaling diameter, the scaling cylinder. So the taper, everything that grows towards, as the log gets bigger towards the bottom, the sawmill gets for free because they're only paying for the scaling cylinder.
Interesting.
And so there's a continual trade-off between judging where to cut the log length to try to minimize what's lost in taper. So there is a lot to it, like everything else.
Now, you mentioned, speaking about the evolution of the technology around logging, we understand the logging with a cat and a yarder, and you mentioned a feller buncher and some of these sort of, I don't know how new they are, but a lot of the modern logging equipment I've seen, it looks like it's the only way to go. It crawls in, it cuts it. It's like an excavator with this super dynamic reticulating saw incorporating limb cutting off. Is that a feller buncher?
That is. So full disclosure, I've never worked around a feller buncher. Okay, that came in just as I stepped out. But there are feller bunchers and forwarders. And the feller buncher, as I understand it, does just what you said. Grabs a tree, cuts it off, rotates a tree, and the tree is pulled through this articulating head, and it bumps all the limbs off, and it automatically stops when the right distance has gone through and cuts it.
All without letting go of the
Without
log.
setting it down. That's right.
So you can then set it in a stack.
Yep. So
clean and ready to go.
So the first log will drop off, and the second log will drop off, and maybe the third one's still in the head, and then they can swing around and put those in little bundles. As they work their way through the stand, they're creating little mini stacks.
Yeah.
So that's a feller buncher. And then a forwarder is this, it's like a skidder that we were talking about. It can go anywhere, and it's got a little log trailer on the back and a little loader on the front, and it drives right up into the woods and gets to those mini stacks and throws them on this cart and drives back down to the landing and throws them off. And the choker setters are out of business.
Yeah. And what an amazing advancement in technology in terms of safety. Because now you have fellers who are not getting crushed, choker setters, hook slingers, all those guys around the yarder. It's just all of a sudden the most dangerous parts are happening from inside of a cab of a piece of equipment.
You're enclosed with steel tubing and big heavy screen and bulletproof glass. And if you don't roll the machine down to the bottom of the canyon, you are almost always going to go home at the end of the day.
God, man, these heavy equipment it's just so underrated, at least by the common man, in terms of it's technology. I mean, it's like it's greasy and rough and ugly and rusty, but that is the most beautiful technology that lowers the price of lumber, saves lives.
Yeah.
Reduces the cost for a landowner. Let's say they want to log their property. What would a landowner have to pay in terms of the cost to get the money out of their stand of trees?
Great question. It was often done on a share basis. When Dad and I, when I moved back here, bought in with Dad, logging, came back from Las Vegas, tired of construction, we were logging for 40%. Whatever came from the mill, 40% of it divided by the mill went to us, and 60% went to the landowner.
Got it.
Now, that's a sizable chunk of money. So when a logger comes along that has a feller buncher and a processor, a feller buncher and a forwarder, and it's just two guys doing this, and they get maybe, 7 or 8 times as much work done in a day.
Yeah.
Boom, they could do it for a lower price.
Yeah.
Which either A, leaves more money for the landowner, or B, enables the sawmill to push down the number they're paying for the logs.
Yeah.
Which in theory at least, eventually means the boards you buy at Home Depot or wherever you buy them are going to cost you less money.
Yeah. Talk for a little minute about how people make big money in timber. In other words, if you're just cutting trees, you can only, even if you're the best, you can only cut so many in a day.
That's right.
And if you're a small logging shop, it's kind of the same thing. You're limited by labor. So where is the big money in timber made?
So first of all, I'm really not qualified to answer that because I never made any big money in logging. But I've known a few loggers, and the only people I've ever known that made any real money ended up in a position where they were buying and selling the commodity rather than doing the work.
Putting the deals together.
But there are some people around here who just by dint of sheer grit built little logging companies up that made some real money.
Mm-hmm.
Made some. I mean, at least as measured by the amount of equipment in the yard, the amount of work they did, and the amount of, there are some log trucking firms here, Ireland and Gene Whitaker, big fleets of trucks.
Mm-hmm.
They've been iconic on the roads around here for decades. Some logging companies the same way. Kenneth Ford that I mentioned earlier, but he wrapped his arms around the whole thing and pretty soon was buying large tracts of land and all of that.
So he would buy land. He owned the mill. He had logging crews, I guess, who would go in, and it was all under his umbrella.
That's where he ended up. But to begin with, he was one of the 243 mills operating in Douglas County.
I
Small.
missed that part.
Small.
Okay.
So it's just like everything else. It is the money and the capital that facilitates stepping out of a blue collar a blue collar life.
Yeah.
But that comes with its own set of pluses and minuses,
Yeah. Well, think about it's like any business. Let's say a painting business, but it might sound nice to have I got 800 painting crews out or 80.
Yeah.
But you know how many headaches come with, let's say, 80 log trucks? I can't even imagine. You know how many tires that you're maintaining? You got to have 10 big O tires just to keep you going.
That's right. How often are you blowing a head gasket on a loaded log truck on a steep grade somewhere? And how in the world do you get that thing safely to where you can even work on it?
Yeah, there's probably just... I'm sure if we had the owner of one of these companies, they'd be kind of like, well, there's money, but it's not easy.
Yeah. It's the rule. There is no easy money,
But putting the deal together. So for example, I could imagine I don't know, I'm sure there's brokers in some extent with timber, but buying a piece of land that has timber on it one price, selling it for the appropriate price, taking the value of the timber, or maybe removing the timber, selling it. I'm sure there's money in that sort of transition.
So there's an example of a way that people like us sometimes hit real long balls with timber, and that is finding a ranch with timber on it where the timber is undervalued, real estate being an imperfect market, buying the ranch, harvesting the trees, getting the value out of the trees, still having the value of the land. All of a sudden, a working man gets a leg up, gets a leg up. And I know I've got a good friend, Bjorn Vian, who did that several times. Yeah. And then he was smart. He was smart and he was conservative, and Bjorn has done so well in this way.
That's cool.
The log buyers, the guys that work for the mills, are buying the logs, buying the tracts, are in a position to really be able to capitalize on this. Pretty soon they really learn values.
Yeah, good point.
And they see the deals, and those guys make money. They are disparagingly referred to by the men on the ground as timber maggots.
Yeah.
Okay. But we're always jealous of the people that make more money than we do.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like the real estate broker doing the $6 million Beverly Hills home and making 1%.
Yeah.
Must be nice.
Must be nice
to just close the deal. All right, let's kind of close and talk about the timber itself. Now around here, it's Douglas fir that I know of that's like the big commodity. Is that it, or is the Northwest growing lots of different types of lumber that I just don't hear about?
That's a good question. And the second part of that is what the reality is. Douglas fir is a dominant species, and I can't tell you exactly why, but it does change with elevation and whether it's north aspect, that is a north-facing slope, or a south-facing slope, soil types. But we have several different kinds of pine trees here: ponderosa pine, white pine, sugar pine. I just got to the end of my expertise on pine. We have whitewood that is grand fir, white fir, lodgepole pine. There, I thought of another pine.
Pine sol.
Pine sol. Pine sol is a big commodity. Yeah. Several kinds of cedar, incense cedar, western red cedar, my all-time favorite wood. Let me just throw that down. I love western red cedar. A little closer to the coast, we have Port Orford cedar. There's an Alaskan yellow cedar. What am I forgetting? So all those things kind of coexist, each in their own sort of part of the geography around here. Mm-hmm. One of the objections of the environmentalist movement is that when we log and replant, and by the way, we do replant. There are more trees by number growing in the United States now than there were when the Pilgrims got here.
Yeah.
But they object to what is termed a monoculture. Well, okay.
Hold on. Environmentalists object to replanting primarily one species of tree? Is that
Yeah,
is that the
they
point?
say we're creating plantations, tree plantations, monoculture.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of, fair enough. Except I've spent quite a lot of time hunting around here, and on ground that was not replanted by humans. And it tends to be monocultures in different areas. You know,
Yeah.
the different soils, different, like I said, those different
right.
circumstances promote and are dominated by one particular species of a conifer. Down along the creek, you'll tend to see more hemlock and white fir, those kinds of things, red cedar. And it's the same when you replant it. So first of all, we can't log down to the creeks anymore, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So those riparian zones have the species that are happy with their feet wet all the time, and that's not Douglas fir.
And plus, I'm sure if you cut those out, the creek loses some sort of stability in the soil and goes all to heck.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
It's a big problem, and that alone is responsible for a lot of the degradation of watersheds. When my dad stepped into logging in, it's probably 53, the Forest Service was specifying that they yard all of the trees out of the creeks. Get them out of the creeks, boys. We don't want the wood in the creek. And now the Department of Fish and Wildlife pays people good money to take logs with the root wads still attached and place them in stream beds to create opportunities for water to dam up and to create shade and interrupt stream flow. So as our knowledge has increased, logging practices have changed. But I don't share the objection to monoculture, because Mother Nature is going to seed what she wants to seed. There will be trees that come in that inhabit the mid-story, the vine maple and the alders along the creeks, those things. This country, it doesn't matter what we do, it's going to grow trees.
Yeah.
It's the best tree growing location in the world.
Yeah. So in terms of the logging, I'm sure that's part of the deal that gets penciled out beforehand. Like, these trees are going to go here to this mill. Those trees we won't take them anyways. So that gets all sorted out in the negotiations.
It's that it is sorted on the landing and sent to different mills, which happens. Big logs go to the few remaining mills that saw big logs. Small logs culls go to a pulpwood mill, or sometimes the camp run price means everything goes to one buyer and then the mill sorts and retrucks to the other places.
That makes sense. If there's only a couple trees, then
small percentage.
You mentioned earlier that homeowners or people might wait till the winter to log because they can sell them for more. So what happens to the log themselves? Do they have to get sawn up kind of right away, or could they be fallen in the summer and then sold in the winter, and it's no different for the mill?
So that's an important question, and that's one of the things that we ran into last winter when we had that big Snowmageddon event here, and millions of trees went to the ground in Douglas County. And they went to the ground in places where the people weren't equipped to get them out, or it wasn't economically viable to go in and get them out, or they weren't pulled out for a year later, and they do degrade. Bugs lay eggs in the bark. The egg hatches. The larva mills its way down into the tree. First, it goes around up between the bark and the cambium layer, precambium, and eventually will drill right in, and the log's wrecked. It is wrecked for commercial application. If you log them and buck them to length and put them in a stack and let them dry out, the drying checks go in from the end, and you lose scale, you lose value. So there is, I'll say, and people can straighten me out if I'm wrong, but once that tree's on the ground and bucked to length and in a stack, you better get it to market within like 3 weeks, or you're going to start taking some cut. And that's determined by the scaler. We didn't even talk about the third party that stands between the seller of the log and the buyer of the log to determine the value of the log. Someone who does not have that profit motive associated with that, the quality and the quantity designation. Scaling Bureau determines how many board feet came in on the truck, what the species, what the grade, what the value. There's a whole very sophisticated protocol of deductions that are made for number of knots, pitch rings, speck or conch, which is a defect. Any number of things can add up to characteristics of the log that means the logger does not get paid for as many board feet
that's
or at a lower rate.
You mentioned checks. So if the end of the board has big checks or kind of cracks starting around, the scaler would look at that and mark down the value.
He would cut off a foot or 2 foot off the length. Okay. So when you're calculating the volume in that scaling cylinder. Or if there's giant knot clusters, it would drop the grade of the log. Even though it's big enough to make a certain grade, the knot clusters would reduce it to a grade that is paid at a lower rate, unless you have a camp run price, and then the whole volume is paid at that set price. So it's pretty Pretty tricky.
Hey, maybe we'll end. Talk about these. They're not new now, but I remember when I was a kid on the way to Glide, there was a stand of trees that they planted with the initials KMX on the side of the hill. In fact, everybody always said that. I could never see it. I think they had already gotten big enough, but I understood that was some sort of genetically modified tree that was supposed to grow faster and be better. Is there a genetically modified tree that surpasses Doug fir?
Thanks for bringing that up. That was planted on a hillside that belonged to Bud Updegrave. He was like Kenneth Ford in terms of larger than life, a guy who started out as a logger and did good, ended up with he did good. He was a remarkable man. And the KMX tree was a hybrid that was developed, I don't know from where, but it was a cross. KMX, I think, meant a hybrid between a knobcone pine and a Monterey pine. KMX, cross. And it was touted as a solution to the world's need for pulp, for paper.
Oh.
Grew so fast, softwood, shoots up, makes wood quicker than any other species, high-grade chips, high-grade paper. Huh. So Bud Updegrave, being a smart man, planted, 200 or 300 acres in KMX right alongside the highway, and then he planted about 30 acres in plain old garden variety Douglas fir, just right on the same hillside.
Yeah. And
we have watched now for the last 50 years as those KMX trees around here would get up to a certain size and then just mysteriously begin to die. And they would come up and they would be all big branches, wolfy, it's called around here. You call a tree that is all branches a grouse ladder or a wolfy tree, okay? And those KMX trees, they were logged essentially about every 5 or 6 years because they were dying off, and none of them ever got to anything significant. And in the meantime, that 30 acres of Douglas fir is just going straight up, reaching for the light, competing with each other. The ones that don't win the race for the light die, leaving space for the trees that live to get bigger and stronger. But in the competition, the lower branches die and fall off, so you get these clear gun barrel stems, highly machinable. And so it's just been a testament to the fact that
they do grow fast.
They grow fast in the right setting, and they grow good, and they grow straight. Yeah. And it's just a testament to the fact that God planted the right wood in this part of the world if you need boards for people to live in.
Yeah, and that's worldwide. I think everywhere in the world, there's no better lumber growing somewhere else that we wish we had access to.
That's right. That's it. Now it's interesting on the other side of the Pacific, Russia, Japan, northern Japan, but Russia, they have Douglas fir over there thriving in exactly the same way that we have over here on the West Coast. In fact, from a certain perspective, someday they are going to finish putting Oregon out of the wood business because the wood over there is like it was here in 1945.
Why is that? Just hasn't been logged as much?
The infrastructure didn't go in to log it. The winters are so cold that they only haul, as I understand it, they haul their logs out in the winter on the frozen rivers. And they haven't had the disposable income to punch the roads in like we have here.
Wow.
So I expect that eventually we'll see a lot of that Douglas fir from the other side of the Pacific coming to market somewhere.
All right, well, we're going to wrap that up. There's quite a bit here that I don't know, and I'm sure we could have more of this conversation. So if this was interesting, please let us know in the comments on YouTube. We really appreciate everybody watching this channel. Of course, our main channel, but we're trying to grow this part of our business here because I don't know, things are changing, and our spec house is going to be done pretty soon. At some point, and we're looking to make more of this type of content, get some more interesting people here. I'd like to have a similar conversation with someone who knows a lot about oil fields.
Yeah, no kidding.
I've been on a couple. I drove through Farmington, New Mexico years ago, and I remember seeing oil pumps everywhere and just thinking like, wow. And I met a lot of people in that town who, blue collar people, and everyone like, oh, we work in the oil field. Anyways, probably kind of like here, everybody works in the forest.
Same.
So it'd be fun to have a conversation with a person like that, maybe somebody from a mining town also. Mm-hmm. So any other comments on logging or timber you want to leave the listeners with?
Maybe just this, that when I left Las Vegas after 8 years in a high production construction environment where you had to be careful and never make a mistake and don't break anything and don't, where you were assembling and it had to be assembled right. It was such a relief to come up here, buy in with Dad, and start logging for a while, where you were paid to tear the world apart.
Yeah.
Where the faster you ran and the more leverage you could use, it was great. But every time I would walk into a little draw somewhere and sword ferns up to my waist and these beautiful trees that were just standing there doing their good work. A logger is not blind to the fact that he is devastating something beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay? But the comfort always came when, as I was working in there devastating those forest glades, I would realize that I was making the second or third, in some cases, set of stumps. That there were stumps in there that had been created by other men, harvesting the fiber that other people had lived their lives in and had been paid to produce, and who had depended on the fiber for comfort. And yet that little glade and that little draw had come back. It had regenerated. It was back. And it is a comfort to know that till the end of time, when a logger goes in and does his work and leaves, and it is honorable work, Mother Nature, whatever she consists of in your worldview, is going to put that mess back together and set it right, and beauty will emerge again.
Yeah, we really didn't get into the environmental aspect, but a lot of those mills have shut down because it's difficult to log now because of environmental regulations and such. So we got to touch on that next time, but
maybe bring an expert in for that.
Yeah, it's also beautiful. They, like I said, they replant like crazy, and you can just drive up the hill right here into an area of, I don't know how old they are, but trees 10 feet tall, and it's pretty neat. It's like packed full of trees.
They're
and
back.
There's birds and rabbits in it, and
they're consuming CO2 and giving off oxygen just as fast as they can.
Yeah. So I think it'd be neat for people who are maybe from a different part of the country to, if they're ever in this area, just get off the road and just drive up there, and you'll be amazed. You'll look out and see like, oh my gosh, that was cut recently. That looks older. Yeah. There's some huge trees. It looks kind of neat. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you all next time.